Hotel guests reported cries for help from Keanu Reeves's penthouse. What police found behind the door wasn't a crime scene, but something far more human. A dozen strangers, tears in their eyes, sitting in silence around him. Why were they there? And what was Keanu hiding that stunned even the officers? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Bellevue Grand stood tall against the Los Angeles skyline, its polished glass exterior glowing under city lights. For years, it had been a haven for celebrities seeking luxury and anonymity. On most nights, the hotel hummed with quiet elegance. But this Tuesday night, something felt different. At 9:10 p.m., the concierge line blinked red. Brandon Hale, the evening front desk manager, answered with his usual warm professionalism. On the other end was Mrs. Helen Moore, a retired professor from Maine, currently staying in room 2048. Her voice, though polite, carried a subtle tension. "I don't mean to be dramatic," she began, "but I keep hearing something from the floor above. Weeping, maybe. Footsteps. It's been going on for a while now, and I thought someone might want to check." Brandon glanced at the logbook. The penthouse above Mrs. Moore, room PH1, was occupied. He squinted at the screen. No name listed, just a VIP designation and a privacy hold. Not unusual for A-listers, probably an actor or a tech billionaire. "I understand, ma'am," Brandon said. "Thank you for letting us know. We'll look into it." But as he hung up the call, he hesitated. It wasn't the first time someone had mentioned odd sounds from the penthouse. A guest 2 doors down had mentioned something earlier that afternoon, low murmuring, like someone pacing and talking to themselves. At the time, Brandon dismissed it. The penthouse suite often hosted guests dealing with stress, press tours, or private meetings. He made a note in the internal log. Noise complaint, room PH1. Investigate if repeated. 20 minutes passed. Then the phone rang again. This time it was Mr. Derek Wallace in room 2052, just down the hall from Mrs. Moore. His voice wasn't anxious, it was annoyed. "Sorry to bother you, but there's definitely something going on upstairs. It sounds like someone's dragging furniture or pacing nonstop. My wife and I are trying to relax, but it's starting to feel unsettling." Brandon thanked him and hung up, his fingers hovering over the phone. He looked around the quiet lobby. The jazz music playing overhead felt out of place suddenly. He buzzed the security desk. "Carl, can you do a soft knock on PH1? Just a courtesy check. Couple guests have reported some odd noises." Carl, a retired Marine turned night guard, sighed. "Copy that. I'll go now." The elevator doors closed with a gentle hiss as Carl rode up. Brandon returned to the front desk and began sorting a new batch of room keys, trying to push the incident out of his mind. But as the minutes ticked by, the air around him felt heavier. Something in his gut stirred. By 9:40, Carl had not checked back. Brandon picked up the radio. "Carl, status on PH1? Silence." He repeated the call. Nothing. Just as he was about to escalate, the security feed blinked. Carl was back in the elevator. He looked pale. His usually calm face was tense. When Carl stepped back into the lobby, Brandon walked over immediately. "Well?" Brandon asked, trying to keep his voice light. Carl took a breath. "I didn't knock. I got up there and stood outside the door. I could hear it, man. Someone's in there, pacing like they've been walking in circles for hours. No voices, just that sound. Over and over again." Brandon frowned. "That's it?" "No." There was crying. Not wailing, but soft, controlled, like someone trying not to cry, then it just stopped. Cold. Gave me chills. Brandon hesitated, looking toward the desk. "Do we know who's staying in PH1? Carl shook his head. "Anonymous booking, high-tier client. They booked the whole top floor." Brandon paused, then said quietly, "I think we need to call the GM." Upstairs, the penthouse suite remained dark from the outside, all curtains drawn. No staff had been permitted in since the guest checked in 3 days ago. Even housekeeping had been turned away with a polite, "Do not disturb" note left at the elevator entrance to the private floor. Brandon Hale stepped into the back office and dialed the number for Alan Stokes, the general manager of the Bellevue Grand. Alan, a veteran of luxury hospitality, rarely answered calls during evening hours unless something was seriously wrong. Tonight, he picked up on the second ring. "Brandon, I think we've got a situation upstairs in PH1, Brandon said quietly. Alan sighed. "Another noise complaint?" 2 more in the last hour, and Carl says he heard crying, pacing, then total silence. "Do we know who's up there yet?" "No ID in the system. VIP privacy hold. But we were told to expect someone extremely high profile." "That's all they gave us?" Alan paused. "Give me 15. I'm heading in." By the time Alan arrived through the private staff entrance, the hotel lobby had gone quiet again. The calls from guests had stopped, but a lingering tension remained. Brandon filled him in on the details, showing the log entries and the security footage of Carl stepping out of the elevator with that haunted look. Alan reviewed everything in silence, then asked, "What's the guest check-in signature?" Brandon hesitated. "Just the initials, KR." Alan froze for a beat. "Wait, KR? Are you saying—" Brandon nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think it might be Keanu Reeves." Alan exhaled and sat down in one of the leather chairs beside the desk. Why would he be here under the radar? Last I heard, he was wrapping up a film shoot overseas. Brandon shrugged. Maybe something happened. Upstairs, nothing had changed. The penthouse cameras were all disabled, as per the VIP's privacy requirements. But the tension grew, as if the walls themselves were aware something was wrong. Alan made the call to the in-house security supervisor, ordering a full welfare check. Carl and another guard, Lisa Torres, prepared for the elevator ride up. Neither spoke during the ascent. When they reached the penthouse floor, they approached the suite door slowly. No sound came through this time. The silence now felt more ominous than the earlier pacing. Carl knocked softly. No response. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Liza leaned in and whispered, "You sure someone's still in there?" Carl nodded. "Trust me. I know what I heard." Alan's voice came through their earpieces. "We're unlocking the master override. Be prepared." Seconds later, the lock clicked. Carl turned the handle and pushed the heavy door open slowly. The lights inside were dim. The suite smelled faintly of sandalwood and something sharper. Cleaning solution, maybe. Furniture was untouched. No signs of struggle. No broken glass. No open windows. Then, Carl saw the shoes. A pair of dark leather boots sat neatly by the entrance, soaked from rain. The city hadn't seen a drop in weeks. Liza moved ahead toward the main sitting room. Her voice came low and tense. "He's here." Carl followed. At the center of the room, facing the massive floor-to-ceiling window, a man sat on the edge of the sofa. Shoulders hunched, head low, wearing all black. His hands were clasped in front of him. They knew without seeing his face. It was him, Keanu Reeves. But he didn't move, didn't look up, and didn't speak. Alan's voice crackled softly in Carl's earpiece. "What's his condition?" Carl didn't answer right away. He stepped forward cautiously. Liza remained still by the doorway, her hand resting over her radio but not raising it. Keanu's breathing was steady, almost meditative, but his eyes were distant, fixed on something far beyond the lights of Los Angeles outside that window. His face was pale, lips slightly parted, as if he'd been speaking to someone just moments before, but the room was empty. No guests, no assistants, no notes, no sound. Carl knelt down a few feet away, Mr. Reeves? Still no response. Liza took a step forward. Sir, we received reports of distress. Is everything all right? Keanu finally blinked. Then, as if surfacing from deep water, he turned his head slightly toward them. His voice came low, nearly a whisper. You heard them too? Carl's brow furrowed. Sir? Keanu nodded once. The voices. Alan, still listening from downstairs, leaned closer to the monitor. Voices? But before more could be said, Keanu stood up, slowly, calmly. He looked at both guards and said quietly, There are stories that only silence can hold. Then he walked toward the back hallway and disappeared into the shadows of the suite. Carl and Liza stood frozen. Neither moved, neither followed, because somehow it felt like whatever had just happened wasn't over. It was only beginning. At precisely 9:45 p.m., the second call came in. Brandon Hale was in the middle of assisting a newly arrived couple when the concierge tapped him gently on the arm. You've got another one, Mr. Hale. Line 3. It's coming from the 10th floor. Brandon excused himself, stepped into the back office, and picked up the phone. Front desk. This is Brandon speaking. A voice, calm but clearly disturbed, spoke. Yes? Hello? I'm staying in room 1033. I'm the Vice President of Operations for Langdon Financial Group. I normally wouldn't complain about noise, but there's something strange going on upstairs. Brandon pressed the receiver closer. Can you describe what you're hearing? It started about 20 minutes ago. It was soft at first, like someone crying or maybe in prayer. But then it changed. I could swear I heard more than one voice. It's overlapping, like multiple people talking, but no words I can make out. It's unsettling. Brandon jotted down the room number and time, then added the new note under the file for Penthouse Suite 52. He had just returned to the desk when another call lit up the panel. This one from room 1140. Good evening, Bellevue Grand, Brandon greeted, trying to keep his tone even. This is Professor Raymond Ellis. I apologize for the late hour, but I believe someone is in serious emotional distress in the penthouse above me. I heard what sounded like sobbing, but then there were voices, a chorus, not one or two. I'm a retired linguistics professor, and even I couldn't make sense of the cadence. It didn't sound like any known language. It was rhythmic, like a ritual. Brandon's fingers froze on the keyboard. This wasn't a drunken argument. This wasn't an angry phone call. This was something else. Something much stranger. He ended the call with polite reassurances and turned to the night security station, where Alan was reviewing surveillance footage from the elevators. Alan, Brandon said, lowering his voice. We have 3 separate guests reporting strange activity from Penthouse 52. Not just noise, multiple voices, sobbing, and something that sounds like chanting. Alan furrowed his brow and swiveled to face the monitors. There's only one person registered in that room, Keanu Reeves. He hasn't left. He hasn't had visitors logged, no room service, no calls in or out. Brandon took a deep breath. That's what worries me. Alan's eyes didn't move from the screen. Is it possible he's just watching something emotional? A movie, maybe? Brandon shook his head. Then why would 3 different people report it as human voices? Why now? Why all saying it sounds unnatural? Liza, now back from the suite, walked in just in time to hear the tail end of the conversation. You're not going to believe what I saw, she said. Alan and Brandon turned toward her. I've never felt that kind of tension in a room before. Like it was charged with something you can't see, but you feel it all over your skin. Mr. Reeves didn't say anything rude. He was calm, too calm, and before we left, he said something that made my stomach twist. What was it? Brandon asked. He said, You heard them too. There was silence in the small operations room. Then Alan leaned forward. We need to check that room again. Brandon paused at the edge of the monitor bay. His hand hovered above the radio, thumb shaking slightly above the button. This wasn't part of standard procedure. Usually by now any noise complaint faded into routine hotel chatter. But tonight, it wasn't fading. It was building. Before he could speak, the front desk phone rang again. It was the first-floor night auditor. "Brandon, I don't want to alarm you, but I just had a guest from room 1112 walk by. He stopped me in the hallway, pale as a sheet, and said he felt like he was being watched the entire way back to his room. He kept glancing up at the ceiling. Said he heard whispering, not from the hallway, above." Brandon thanked him and hung up slowly. He turned to Alan and Liza. "This isn't random. It's spreading down the floors, the sound, the feeling." Alan double-checked the elevator logs. Still no movement from the penthouse. No guests registered for that room but Keanu. "But look at this." He pulled up the live hallway camera outside penthouse 52. All was quiet. Too quiet. No staff, no trays, no movement. The hallway looked untouched. Brandon leaned closer. "Zoom in on the door." Alan did. Room 52's doorframe came into focus. Nothing appeared damaged, no obvious issues with the handle, but the peephole shimmered faintly under the infrared filter. "What is that?" Liza whispered. Brandon narrowed his eyes. Reflection, maybe? Or the camera flickered. Just once. Then it stabilized. But in that half-second flicker, all three of them saw it. A shape in the corner of the hallway. Not quite human, not quite anything they could define. It was there, and then it wasn't. Alan backed away from the monitor. "Okay, we call the general manager now." "No," Brandon said. "He'll say wait until morning. I'm not risking it. Not if more guests start calling." As if on cue, another phone lit up. Room 921, then 854, then 818, all reporting the same thing. Voices. Not yelling, not fighting, but calling. Soft, repetitive, and layered. One guest described it as a melody without music. Another called it a room full of ghosts, weeping in harmony. Brandon pressed his palms to the desk, heart pounding. Liza sat slowly. "We need to go back up there, but not alone." Alan shook his head. "If this turns out to be a breakdown or a medical issue, we'll need emergency response. I'm calling city dispatch for a welfare check." Brandon hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Alan stepped out to use the secure landline. Meanwhile, Brandon returned to the front desk, where a growing line of confused and unsettled guests had begun to gather. Some just wanted reassurance. Others whispered about seeing shadows move behind their curtains or hearing knocking with no one there. Brandon remained calm, assuring them everything was under control. But the truth was far from it. Back in the operations office, Liza reopened the service log and checked every request made from Penthouse 52 that day. There were none. Not one towel, not one food order, no maid request, no laundry, nothing. It was as if the room was sealed off, occupied but untouched. Brandon returned, pale. "City dispatch is sending officers. ETA is 25 minutes. Until then..." His voice trailed off. Until then, they were on their own. And every passing second, the sense of unease deepened. Not just among the guests, but in the bones of the building itself. By the time the elevator dinged at the penthouse level again, security officer Darnell Hughes had joined Brandon and Liza. Darnell had been with the hotel for over 15 years. He didn't scare easily. But even he admitted the calls tonight were stranger than usual. As they stepped into the corridor outside room 52, the silence felt dense, like air thickened with grief. The floor was eerily spotless. Every light glowed softly, casting long shadows that refused to settle. Darnell knocked once. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He leaned in and listened. A murmur. Very faint, but there. Multiple voices, like someone having a prayer circle in hushed tones. But there were no registered guests other than Keanu Reeves. No staff scheduled to meet him tonight. Brandon pressed his ear against the door. The moment he did, his eyes widened. The sound wasn't just voices, it was emotion. It was crying. Not chaotic, but orchestrated, controlled. Grief that moved in rhythm, like waves hitting a shore. Darnell whispered, "I don't think this is a party." They pulled back, glancing at one another in silence. No one dared to open the door yet. Something about it didn't feel like their place. But soon, that decision wouldn't be theirs to make. Brandon Hale had handled his fair share of celebrity eccentricities. Crying fits, loud arguments, late-night music, even mysterious visitors in the early hours. He'd seen it all during his time at the Bellevue Grand. But something about the situation unfolding in the penthouse tonight left him uneasy. It wasn't just the volume of complaints. It was the tone in the guests' voices when they called in, shaky, uncertain, like they weren't sure if what they were hearing was real or imagined. At 10:15 p.m., Brandon made the decision to go up himself, alone. Not because he didn't trust security, but because he needed to assess this firsthand. If anyone could de-escalate something quietly without offending a high-profitable guest, it was him. He rode the elevator to the top floor, feeling the air change as it climbed. He always noticed the temperature drop slightly up there, like the penthouse existed in a quieter atmosphere than the rest of the building. As the doors opened, he stepped into the hall with calm but alert eyes. Room 52, the penthouse suite. Brandon approached with careful steps, clipboard tucked under one arm. The hallway was pristine, as expected. The gold trim on the door shimmered under the soft lighting. The brass nameplate beside the room number read, Charles Andrews, a name Brandon knew well. It was one of Keanu Reeves' most frequently used aliases for hotel stays. Discreet, forgettable, just the way Keanu liked it. He stood outside the door and paused. At first, there was nothing, just the hum of the hallway's air conditioning and the muffled drone of city traffic from 30 floors below. Then he heard it again, a low, layered murmur, not conversation, not argument, a rhythm. There were soft voices, multiple, but all speaking with a strange, synchronized cadence. Between those voices, there was the sound of weeping, but it wasn't sharp or sudden. It was quiet, controlled, the kind of sorrow that didn't seek attention. Brandon frowned. Something about it felt reverent, like a ritual almost. Not a party, not a breakdown, but something more private, more sacred. He leaned closer, just slightly. The door was thick, but the voices pulsed through like breath through cloth. Someone spoke what sounded like a name, then silence, then a whisper that was impossible to make out. Brandon gently pulled back. He took a deep breath and checked his watch. 10:19 p.m. No screaming, no panic, no signs of distress. He tapped the door once with the back of his knuckle, not to be heard, just to announce presence. He waited. He wasn't sure if anyone inside had heard him, or if they had and simply chose not to acknowledge. His hand hovered over the emergency contact line on his phone, but he didn't dial. He knew who was behind that door. Keanu Reeves, a man with a history few people truly understood. A man who had endured personal tragedy more quietly than most people could ever imagine. The hotel staff had a strict protocol. Celebrities were to be given full privacy unless there was a clear and immediate threat to safety. This wasn't that. Not yet. And something inside Brandon told him this wasn't an emergency. It was a moment, and it wasn't his to interrupt. He turned around slowly, clipboard still tucked under his arm, and walked back toward the elevator. Whatever was happening inside room 52, it wasn't chaos. It was grief. And grief, he thought, had its own rules. Back at the front desk, Brandon documented the visit in the internal log without elaborating. He used vague language, audible emotional activity, no threat detected, no intervention made. the kind of wording that satisfied legal policy without betraying privacy. He didn't tell the staff anything more than necessary. He just sat down at the console and rewatched the security feed showing the penthouse hallway. Still. Quiet. Nothing unusual. Just that door, unmoving. But something about that quiet unsettled him more than any shouting ever could. Brandon poured himself a cup of coffee from the break station and took it to the side office. He closed the door, sat in the creaky swivel chair, and leaned back. What he heard outside that room didn't sound like a party gone wrong. It didn't sound like an argument, a meltdown, or a confrontation. It sounded like mourning. And not the fresh kind, the long, held-in kind. The kind that returns when the world finally goes quiet around you. He glanced at the guest file again. Charles Andrews. Checked in 2 nights ago, solo reservation, no registered guests. Keanu was known for keeping things minimal, but something still felt off. Brandon had a gut for tension. He'd worked private events where celebrities cracked under pressure, lashed out, lost control. This wasn't that. This was controlled, quiet, and somehow heavier. Brandon pulled up the suite's minibar charges. Nothing had been touched, not even the water. The room service log showed just 1 meal request, soup and tea, ordered the night before. A server had dropped it at the door, and it remained untouched when they picked it back up. The pattern painted a picture. Someone had come to that suite not to be entertained, not to indulge, but to be alone, maybe even to remember. And yet, those voices, those strange, synchronized voices, they lingered in Brandon's mind like a song you couldn't forget. Who were they? Friends? Family? Were they all mourning someone together? He didn't think Keanu had many close companions. The man had built his entire image on simplicity, solitude, and respect for boundaries, which made the presence of multiple voices even more unusual. Brandon tapped his fingers on the desk and stared out the frosted window. He couldn't call the police. There was no crime, and calling Keanu directly would be a violation unless there was a confirmed emergency. Still, the unease in his chest hadn't faded. It was quiet now, but something told him the story hadn't ended. The phone buzzed on his desk. It was a message from another floor manager. Guest in 2046 called again. Same complaint. Says it's not just crying now. Says it sounds like prayer. Brandon read the message twice. Prayer. The word didn't fit with anything he knew about standard hotel noise complaints, but it echoed what he'd felt upstairs, like a vigil, a ceremony of sorts. He stood up and walked back toward the front desk, pausing to glance again at the elevator. He could go back up. Knock. Insist. But then what? Risk humiliating a guest who had done nothing wrong? Or worse, shatter a moment that was sacred? He chose instead to wait, watch, be available. If it escalated, he'd act. But for now, he'd protect the silence. Because sometimes silence wasn't a void. It was a presence. And whatever was happening in that penthouse, it deserved to finish speaking before anyone interrupted. Upstairs, behind the heavy double doors of the penthouse, Keanu Reeves stood barefoot in the center of the room. The city stretched endlessly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he wasn't looking at it. His eyes were fixed on a small table near the corner, where a candle flickered beside a framed photograph and a folded piece of parchment. He wasn't alone. Not in the literal sense. There were no other people in the suite, but memories filled every inch. He had taken the alias Charles Andrews for a reason. It was the name his daughter had once used in a drawing, imagining him as a character in a story they never finished writing together. A father-daughter spy team. He had held on to the name ever since. The voices earlier were recordings, voicemails, messages, audio files stored for years. Tonight, he'd played them all. Not to hear them, but to feel them. His daughter's laughter, caught in the crackle of old cassette tapes, A lullaby she once hummed, now looped in digital distortion. His own voice, reading her a bedtime story on her 5th birthday. He had spoken no words aloud tonight, but in his stillness, everything had been said. He sat down now, beside the table, and placed his hand on the photo. Not crying, just breathing. Rachel Torres didn't hesitate. She had worked security for over 20 years, first in the military, then corporate, now hotel executive protection. The Bellevue Grand attracted its share of high-profile clientele, but rarely did the walls tremble with the kind of emotion she'd just heard. She stood outside penthouse 26C, clipboard in hand, ears tuned to the gaps in the thick mahogany door. She could clearly distinguish more than one voice. First, a man's low murmur, strained and cracking. Then another voice, higher pitched, almost a sob. It sounded like a young boy, maybe a teenager, though Rachel reminded herself that emotions had a way of distorting tone. What unsettled her wasn't just the presence of voices, but the fact that none of them sounded casual. They didn't sound like people laughing, watching a movie, or even arguing over dinner. They sounded broken. She took a breath and stepped back. There were legal limits to what she could do. No signs of violence, no one screaming for help, no thuds or crashes. But something was off. Intuition had saved her life before, and it whispered now. This wasn't normal. Brandon Hale approached quietly, holding a printout of the guest file. "Still going?" he asked, glancing toward the door. He'd hoped maybe things had quieted down. Rachel nodded. "It's not a party," she said simply. "There's grief in there, you can feel it." Brandon hesitated, holding up the file. "Registered to Charles Andrews, but we know who that really is." Rachel already knew. She remembered the private suite reservation, the false name used often by celebrities to avoid attention. She also remembered the silent check-in. No entourage, no assistant, just one man, dressed in black, sunglasses on at night, who walked past the lobby like he belonged to a different dimension. Keanu Reeves. Most people respected his privacy. Rachel did too, but this wasn't about curiosity. It was about safety. "I'm not going to force the door," Rachel said, voice steady. "But I am going to notify LAPD, discreetly. Let them assess it." Brandon shifted on his feet. "Is that necessary? I mean, it's him." "That's why it is necessary," Rachel replied. "If something's wrong, he deserves help. And if nothing's wrong, we document that we followed procedure. No lights, no sirens, just quiet backup." Brandon exhaled slowly, nodding. "Okay, I trust you." Rachel didn't wait. She stepped aside and pulled out her radio, switching to a secure frequency. Her words were coded but clear. She requested a welfare check for a possible emotional disturbance, stressing no visual threat, just elevated emotional volume. She gave the room number, advised no knock until she arrived with them. Then she leaned her shoulder against the cool hallway wall. Her mind kept replaying what she'd heard. Not just pain, not just sadness. It was something deeper, like confession, a ritual of mourning happening behind a closed door. Downstairs, guests continued to check in. A birthday party wrapped up in the ballroom. Housekeeping pushed carts past rooms lit by luxury and comfort. But on the 26th floor outside one silent door, the air was different. Rachel stayed put, watching, waiting, wondering. Who were those voices? Why did one sound like a young girl repeating the word daddy? Why did Keanu, a man known for silence and solitude, suddenly seem surrounded by ghosts? She didn't have answers, but help was on the way. The LAPD dispatched 2 plainclothes officers from their mental health crisis unit, Detective Elena Cruz and Officer Trey Landon. They were trained for delicate situations like this. No sirens, no uniforms, no assumptions. Just quiet presence, calm voices, and careful judgment. Rachel met them in the service hallway behind the penthouse corridor. She briefed them on what she'd heard. Distressed voices, Possible emotional breakdown? No signs of violence or physical danger. She emphasized the identity of the guest and the need for absolute discretion. Detective Cruz nodded. We've dealt with grief spirals before. Sometimes it's just someone needing space to break down safely. About 6 voices, Officer Landon asked, brows raised. That's what I heard, Rachel replied. At least 6, all emotional, like some kind of emotional purging. The team made their way slowly to the front of penthouse 26C. Rachel paused once more to listen. It was quieter now, but not silent. There was a strange sound, soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on wood. Then a pause. Then a single sentence, muffled by the door but still piercing. I still see her every time I close my eyes. The officers glanced at each other. Rachel inhaled. That's his voice. Detective Cruz gently knocked on the door. Not loud, just enough to be heard. They waited. Nothing. She knocked again. Mr. Andrews? It's hotel security. We just want to check in, make sure you're okay. Still nothing. Rachel tried. Sir, this is Rachel from Bellevue Security. We're not here to intrude. We just want to make sure everything is all right. A long silence followed. Then, footsteps. Slow, uncertain. The lock clicked. The door opened just an inch. Rachel leaned forward. Through the small gap, she saw Keanu's face. His eyes were red, not from drugs or alcohol, but from something deeper. His expression wasn't angry or afraid. It was exhausted, hollowed. He looked at Rachel, then at the 2 officers behind her. He didn't speak, just nodded once. Rachel kept her voice low. Mr. Reeves, we received a few calls. Guests heard some emotional sounds. We just want to make sure no one's in danger, not even you. Keanu blinked. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, he stepped back and opened the door. The officers didn't barge in. They waited until he gave a tiny motion with his hand. Permission. Inside, the room was dimly lit. The air was heavy. No one else was visible, yet the space felt full. A glass of water sat untouched on the table. A worn notebook lay open beside it, filled with handwriting and small sketches. On the far side of the room, a chair faced the window. The drapes were drawn just enough to let in city light. Beside the chair, a child's toy, a small wooden horse, worn with age, sat on the floor. Officer Landon took a step forward. Sir, are you alone right now? Keanu nodded once, then whispered, Yes. Detective Cruz kept her tone gentle. We heard several voices. Is there a reason for that? He looked down, almost ashamed. Then he said quietly, Sometimes the past echoes. Rachel felt something shift in the air. Not fear, not confusion, just sorrow that ran so deep it needed space to be spoken aloud. Keanu didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. And for the moment, no one pressed further. Detective Cruz stepped inside, scanning the room. It was quiet. No overturned furniture, no mess. Just a space filled with invisible weight. A soft lamp lit the corner, casting a faint glow over a stack of letters, a child's toy horse, and a single framed photo. Keanu sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same black shirt. His eyes were glassy, distant. Mr. Reeves, Cruz said gently, we're here for your well-being. We received multiple calls. Are you okay? He didn't look at her immediately. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. She would have turned 18 tomorrow. Rachel stayed silent, the words hitting harder than expected. Keanu gestured toward the table. I come here every year, same day, same room. I read her letters and mine. I speak them aloud, pretend she's still here. Cruz exchanged a glance with Officer Landon, who softened his posture. The voices, Landon asked carefully. They were you? Keanu nodded. Some of them, some were her words. There was a long pause. Rachel finally said, "Do you need anything from us? Food? Support?" Keanu shook his head. "I just needed to remember her." "In peace." Rachel nodded. "Then we'll file this as a wellness check only. But next year, if you plan to return, just let us know, so we won't worry." He gave the faintest smile. "Thank you." As they exited the room, Cruz whispered, "That wasn't a disturbance. That was devotion." Rachel agreed. He didn't need help, just space. Back downstairs, she logged the visit. No threat. No disruption. Only a note. Room 26, C. Holds memory. Guest at peace. Rachel Torres stood behind the front desk, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she reviewed the log notes Brandon had entered earlier that evening. She had already gone up once, listened outside the penthouse suite, and heard what she could only describe as grief made audible. Low sobs, murmured words, and voices that sounded as though they were drowning in memory. Her instincts told her something deeper was happening in that room, something private, but also, possibly, something dangerous. Brandon Hale glanced at her nervously as he returned from helping another guest. More complaints just came in. A family on the 27th floor now. Same thing, crying, pacing. They say it sounds like someone's in trouble. Rachel didn't answer right away. She stared at the computer screen, the name Charles Andrews still glowing softly on the guest registry. It was just an alias, one she had seen before, used by celebrities who didn't want to be found. But she knew exactly who was in that room. "Keanu Reeves doesn't make scenes," Brandon finally said, breaking the silence. "He's quiet, low profile. If he's up there, maybe he's just grieving. Maybe it's personal." Rachel nodded. "Maybe, but this isn't just one noise complaint anymore. We've had what, 6, 7, 8, Brandon corrected. Since 9/10. All from different rooms." Rachel sighed. "That's a pattern. And even if it's grief, we have a duty of care. If he's not okay, we can't ignore it. But if he is okay and we overstep, we risk violating his privacy, and that could backfire publicly." She didn't need to explain what that meant. A celebrity's privacy, especially someone as revered and quietly admired as Keanu Reeves, was sacred ground. Breaching it, even with good intentions, could cause a media frenzy. It could ruin reputations, and more importantly, it could shatter trust. But on the other side of that line was a different risk. The possibility that something truly tragic was happening behind that door. What if Keanu wasn't alone? What if someone was in crisis? What if this was the last chance to intervene? Rachel looked at the ceiling, thinking. We've called up. No answer. We knocked. No response. We heard voices, more than one. Brandon lowered his voice. But he's alone in that suite. That's what the reservation says. Exactly, Rachel replied. So who are the other voices? The weight of that question hung between them. Rachel felt the pressure build in her chest. Not the kind of pressure that came from fear, but the one that rose from responsibility. I'm not going to force the door, she said. Not yet. But I think we've reached the point where we need to cover ourselves legally. We do a welfare check. We bring in the police. Brandon hesitated. Are you sure? Rachel nodded. If we do nothing and something happens, that's on us. I'd rather apologize to Mr. Reeves later than have to answer why we didn't act. Brandon picked up the hotel phone and started dialing. Rachel grabbed her tablet and began drafting a full incident report, not just for protocol, but for transparency. Everything needed to be documented, every decision made, every voice heard. The call to the Los Angeles Police Department was brief, factual, and devoid of sensationalism. Brandon identified himself, explained that multiple guests had reported ongoing distress sounds from the penthouse suite, and made it clear that the guest was a high-preferable individual. He didn't give Keanu's name outright, only that the suite was reserved under an alias. He described it as a welfare concern, not a criminal event. The dispatcher asked a few clarifying questions. Was anyone heard screaming? Were there any indications of violence? Any sounds of furniture breaking? Or clear signs of someone being physically harmed? No, Brandon said carefully, but the crying hasn't stopped for over an hour, and we now believe there are multiple people inside. Even though the suite was booked for one, the dispatcher confirmed they would send 2 officers to conduct a welfare check. Estimated arrival, 15 minutes. Rachel took a deep breath as she hung up her own radio and motioned for one of the bellhops to discreetly restrict elevator access to the penthouse floor. She didn't want guests wandering up there and creating a scene if law enforcement arrived. Discretion was everything now. She turned to Brandon. Make sure everything is calm in the lobby. We don't need questions right now. Brandon nodded and stepped away. Rachel remained rooted behind the front desk, her tablet still open. She reviewed the incident notes again, then added a new entry. 10:26 p.m. Decision made to request LAPD welfare check for penthouse suite 2801 due to persistent emotional distress, reports. Guest of record, Charles Andrews, confirmed alias. Outside, the night air had turned cool. Downtown Los Angeles buzzed as usual, but inside the lobby of the Bellevue Grand, a strange hush had settled in. Even the background music, normally soft jazz, seemed too loud, too intrusive. Rachel reached over and lowered the volume slightly. She knew how quickly things could spiral once uniforms showed up. Paparazzi might be nearby. The hotel prided itself on protecting its guests, especially ones like Keanu, who never asked for attention. But tonight wasn't about privacy. It was about safety. The line between the two had never felt so thin. The patrol car pulled up quietly at 10:41 p.m. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their presence casual but alert. Rachel met them at the service entrance, bypassing the main lobby to avoid drawing eyes. Suite 2801, she said softly, leading them toward the service elevator. Guest registered under the name Charles Andrews, but you'll recognize him. It's Keanu Reeves. One of the officers nodded, unsurprised. The reports say there are multiple voices? Yes, Rachel replied. Crying, pacing, indistinct speech. Some guests heard things that sound not just sad, agonized. The elevator ride was silent. Rachel stood still, hands folded, her pulse loud in her ears. She felt the gravity of what they were walking into. Not just legally, but emotionally. This wasn't about a celebrity scandal. This was something human, raw. When they reached the penthouse floor, the officers asked Rachel to stay behind. She remained at the elevator while they made their way down the short carpeted hallway. The suite loomed at the far end, massive double doors standing like a gate to another world. The gold plate read simply, 2801. One officer knocked gently. La P. Welfare check. No response. He knocked again, this time more firmly. Mr. Andrews? Mr. Reeves? This is just a welfare check. We're not here to intrude. We only want to make sure everything is okay. Still nothing. But the muffled sounds continued, a kind of low rhythmic whispering, like someone speaking to themselves or to someone who wasn't there. Then another noise, fainter. A sob, choked down. Not theatrical, not loud, just real. The officers exchanged glances. One of them turned the handle, locked. Permission to enter has been requested by management, the first officer said, loud enough to be heard through the door. If no one responds in the next 10 seconds, we will proceed with a non-destructive welfare entry. They waited. Still silence. The younger officer pulled out a master key card given to them by hotel security. He slid it into the reader. The lock clicked softly. The door opened an inch. Then he paused. From inside came a sound so intimate, so full of sorrow, that it froze all three people in place. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't chaos. It was something more unsettling, more private, the sound of someone coming undone, completely alone. Rachel stood frozen just outside the elevator. She couldn't see, but she didn't need to, because in that moment, as the door creaked open and the officers stepped in with slow, cautious movements, Rachel knew that something had broken in that room. Not furniture, not glass. A human silence had fractured, and what spilled out wasn't noise, it was memory. Officer Jordan Lee parked the patrol car along the side entrance of the Bellevue Grand, cutting the engine as the digital dispatch buzzed to life with another update from the front desk. Officer Denise Alvarez, seated beside him, reviewed the summary already flashing on her in-car tablet. Welfare check, penthouse suite, registered under Charles Andrews, a known alias used by Keanu Reeves. Reported sounds of distress, multiple voices, emotional volatility, possible mental health crisis. Jordan glanced at Denise. Keanu Reeves. You ever think we'd be answering a call on him? Denise didn't respond with a joke. She just nodded solemnly. Let's do it right. Inside the hotel lobby, Brandon Hale was waiting near the service elevator, flanked by Rachel Torres, the head of security. Rachel's jaw was set, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, the weight of the decision still lingering on her conscience. She met the officers with a calm but deeply concerned expression. We wouldn't have called you unless we had no other choice, she said. This has been going on for over an hour. We've logged 5 guest complaints from 3 separate floors. All report hearing weeping, pacing, sometimes shouting. Jordan took mental note of the specifics as Denise scanned the time-stamped logs Brandon provided. But it was Rachel's personal observation that struck them both the most. I heard it myself, she added. I placed my ear against the door of the suite. There were at least 6 different voices, distinct, male and female, and not just talking. Crying, like they were grieving. Jordan arched an eyebrow. Any signs of violence? No, not physical, just, Rachel hesitated. Pain, grief, deep, unfiltered emotion. It didn't sound like a party, a film rehearsal, or even a family argument. It felt overwhelming. Denise glanced toward the elevator. And you're certain the guest is Keanu Reeves? Rachel nodded. The name on the reservation is Charles Andrews. That's the alias he's used here for years. He checked in 2 days ago. No entourage, no assistants, just him. Jordan took a deep breath. The situation had now shifted from a potential guest complaint to something more layered. Celebrity status added complexity. Emotional volatility raised the stakes. And the unknown number of voices behind that door? That brought a quiet tension neither officer voiced out loud. We'll keep this low profile, Denise said, but we need to be prepared for anything. Mental health episode, potential overdose, maybe even someone else inside in distress. Rachel hesitated before adding one more detail. I don't think he's in danger, but I do think something important is happening in that room. Something private, but it's spilling out now. Jordan tapped his badge gently. That's why we're here. They discussed the options. Knock and announce, keycard entry, wait for further escalation. After conferring briefly, the team settled on the middle ground. They would approach calmly, give Mr. Reeves every opportunity to respond. No raised voices, no surprises, just presence. As the elevator doors opened and the 4 of them stepped inside, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a typical wellness check. It felt more like they were entering sacred ground, a place where grief had gathered, and maybe, just maybe, where healing was trying to begin. The elevator doors opened to a hushed corridor. The penthouse level was quiet, too quiet. Officers Jordan Lee and Denise Alvarez stepped out slowly, flanked by Rachel Torres and Brandon Hale. The air was heavy, not with danger, but with something else. Sorrow. They approached the suite registered to Charles Andrews, Keanu's alias. From behind the thick door, they could still hear muffled sobs. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't chaos. Just pain, deep and layered. Jordan leaned in close. Then he knocked, firm but gentle. No answer. Another knock. Then a calm voice. "Mr. Reeves, this is Officer Lee with the LAPD. We're checking in to make sure everything is okay." At first, nothing. Then a faint voice replied. Not Keanu's, but a woman's. "He's okay. Please don't come in." Jordan blinked. Denise stepped forward. "Ma'am, can you tell us how many people are in there?" "5, she said. "But not really. We're not hurting anyone. We're remembering." Rachel looked confused. "There's only one registered guest." Denise spoke softly again. "Mr. Reeves, are you okay?" Keanu's voice finally answered, low and steady. "They're not here, but I needed to hear them again." The hallway went still. No one moved. Jordan lowered his hand. Something more than a wellness check was unfolding. Jordan Lee turned to Denise. There was no immediate danger, no crime, but clearly something delicate was unfolding inside that room, something fragile and sacred. They couldn't treat this like a disturbance. They had to treat it like grief. Jordan stepped a little closer to the door. "Mr. Reeves, is anyone in danger? Do you need medical attention?" Keanu's response came after a long pause. "No danger, no medical, just memories. I'm okay, I promise." The officers exchanged a look. Jordan nodded at Rachel, silently requesting privacy. Rachel guided the other hotel staff back to the elevator, her voice hushed. She knew now this wasn't about celebrity or even protocol. It was about respect. Denise crouched near the door. "We're here if you need us," she said gently. "You don't have to open the door. But if you want to talk, we'll listen." Inside, Keanu sat on the floor, legs folded, surrounded by old photographs. His eyes were red but calm. An old cassette player sat beside him, softly playing the voice of a child, his daughter. A recording from years ago. Her laugh filled the room like a ghost returned. Across from him sat a folded piece of clothing, one of her last. The scent of childhood still lingered faintly. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't unstable. He was honoring the past, keeping it alive. From outside, Denise could now hear the faint sounds more clearly. A recording of a birthday, a family moment, multiple voices, not in the room, but echoing through tape and memory. What the guests had heard were echoes of the past playing through speakers. And weeping? It wasn't chaos, it was Keanu, remembering. Denise stood and stepped back. "Let's not escalate," she whispered to Jordan. "This isn't a crisis, it's a man in mourning." Jordan nodded. They both turned toward the elevator, giving one last look at the door behind them. They would file a report, yes, but it would be marked resolved. No action required. They didn't need to intervene. Keanu had already done the hardest part, letting the past speak without running from it. As they left the hallway, the only sound remaining was the soft click of an old cassette rewinding. The hallway outside the penthouse felt unnaturally still as officers Jordan Lee and Denise Alvarez stepped off the elevator. It was just past 11:15 p.m. The quiet hum of recessed lighting was the only sound. Brandon and Rachel remained several paces behind, watching with a mix of duty and deep uncertainty. Jordan approached the penthouse door. "Suite 2500. He raised his knuckles and knocked firmly. "LAPD," he called out. "Mr. Reeves, this is a welfare check. We're just here to make sure everything is okay." Silence. Denise stepped closer, her eyes scanning the small peephole, which remained dark. She pressed her ear lightly against the door. Still no words, but the sound of muffled crying floated through. It wasn't hysterical. It was low, continuous, and utterly heartbreaking. Jordan knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Reeves, Can you hear us? We're not here to intrude. We just want to make sure you're safe." Still no response. Denise checked her watch. Nearly 5 minutes had passed. Procedure dictated caution, but they had already given time and notice. Rachel approached, handing over the master key card with visible hesitation. "Please be gentle," she whispered. Jordan nodded. He slid the card into the reader. The lock clicked. He didn't open the door right away. He looked to Denise. She gave a subtle nod. Together, they slowly pushed the door inward. The room was dark, not pitch black, but dim. Soft lighting glowed from the corners, bouncing faintly off the walls. The curtains were drawn. A faint scent of sandalwood and old cologne lingered in the air. They stepped inside. What they saw stopped them cold. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no chaos. Instead, there were people, 8 of them, sitting in a wide circle on the penthouse floor. Men and women, all dressed simply, some in hospital scrubs, one in a janitor's uniform, another in a faded security jacket. Their heads were bowed. Most were holding small objects, photos, letters, trinkets. Keanu sat among them. His legs were crossed, hands resting gently on his knees. His eyes were closed, tears streaked his cheeks, but his face was calm. Not broken, not unstable, just quiet, present. To his left, a woman in her 60s held a crumpled ultrasound photo. To his right, a teenage boy clutched a framed picture of a man in uniform. No one looked up as the officers entered. It was a vigil, not a protest, not a breakdown, a sacred gathering of shared grief. Jordan froze at the threshold. Denise did the same. The crying they'd heard, it was coming from several of them, soft and unforced. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't an emergency. It was remembrance. And somehow, in the center of it all, Keanu Reeves was not the celebrity. He was just another human being mourning someone he'd lost. Jordan slowly stepped back without saying a word. Denise followed, her voice caught in her throat. Neither officer had seen anything like this in their careers. The hotel had called about crying, voices, possible distress, but what they'd walked into wasn't a mental health emergency. It was something far more intimate, far more sacred. Denise turned to Rachel, who was waiting just down the hall. "They're okay," she said softly. "Not in danger." Rachel blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Jordan stepped forward to clarify. "It's a grief circle. That's what it looks like. No one's intoxicated, no signs of distress in the way we feared, just people processing pain." Rachel stared past them, her professional instincts clashing with a growing curiosity. "Should we shut it down?" Jordan shook his head. "There's nothing to shut down. No laws being broken, no threats. Honestly, I think we'd be the ones doing harm if we interrupted." Inside the room, the silence was palpable. Denise glanced again through the door left slightly ajar. One man began to speak, voice quivering but clear. "I never got to bury my daughter," he said. "She was cremated before I even made it to the hospital. I didn't know where to go with that. Until tonight." No one interrupted him, no one consoled him with cliches. They just listened. Another woman added, "My sister used to call me from rehab. I stopped picking up. When she died, I didn't know how to forgive myself." Keanu didn't say anything tonight. He just handed me this. She held up a small white stone with the word "listen" etched into it. I've never felt so heard. The officers remained still. Something in the room felt almost too delicate to disturb. They knew this wasn't part of the job, but also that walking away might be the most compassionate choice. Back near the elevators, Brandon joined them. "So, what now?" Denise answered. "We document it. We file the welfare check as resolved, but we don't intervene." Jordan added, It's peaceful, private, and powerful. Woodhouse works with people. Rachel nodded slowly, absorbing their words. A part of her wanted to step into that room herself, to sit with whatever loss she hadn't admitted yet. But she stayed back. Inside the suite, another man spoke. "I was a bodyguard once," he said. "Watched the backs of movie stars. But when my son died, no one watched mine. I came here tonight to remember him, but also to remember myself. This circle, it reminded me I still matter." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't lead. He didn't need to. He was simply there, a still figure among the broken, offering no answers, just presence. The officers lingered a few more minutes, then quietly closed the door. In their report, Denise would later write one simple sentence: "No intervention required, healing in progress." As the officers left the suite, they didn't speak. The weight of what they'd witnessed needed time to settle. Rachel stood silently outside the door a few moments longer. Something about what had just happened felt sacred, like they'd stepped into a place where people told the truth for the first time in years. Brandon rejoined her, visibly shaken but quiet. "Do we report anything?" he asked. Rachel paused. "Just say the complaint's resolved." No further explanation. Inside the suite, the guests were still seated in that gentle circle, their voices softer now. Some shared their own stories of loss. Others just sat with their hands over their mouths, nodding. A woman described losing her son to leukemia. A man revealed he hadn't visited his mother's grave in 20 years. When someone asked Keanu why he brought them here, he replied quietly, "Because I didn't want grief to be something we only talk about when it's too late." There was no applause, just understanding. As the gathering ended near midnight, each person received a small unmarked envelope. Rachel opened hers later in the elevator. It read, "Grief is just love with no place to go." And suddenly, the silence felt like something sacred. The suite didn't look like a hotel room anymore. The furniture had been rearranged, lamps dimmed, overhead lights turned off entirely. Pillows, throws, and thick rugs covered the hardwood floor, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a meditation retreat than a luxury penthouse. In the center, a soft circle of people sat cross-legged or leaned into the space between them. No one stood, no one commanded, and that silence was not empty. It was alive. There were 12 people, not counting Keanu. Most of them were middle-aged. A few younger, and at least one elderly man sat with his back against the side of the bed. Their eyes were swollen, their shoulders tense or trembling. Several held tissues that were already crumpled and damp. Others simply held hands. At first, the officers weren't noticed. The door had opened quietly. Rachel and the officers stood on the edge of the scene, unsure whether to speak. What they saw was not disorder or danger. It was pain, structured into something that felt almost sacred. Keanu sat near the window, his posture calm. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't at the center. He had his hand gently resting on the shoulder of a woman who appeared to be in her 30s. She was sobbing, not loudly, but with the kind of shaking that looked like it came from years of holding something in. His touch wasn't commanding. It was permission. Permission to grieve, to unravel without fear. In the middle of the group sat a low wooden box, open at the top. Inside it were folded letters, some clearly aged, others newly written. A few people reached into it during the session, pulled something out, unfolded it, and read. One letter was from a son to a father who never came back from war. Another was from a mother who had lost a child in a drowning accident. Every word was shared, quietly. Nobody interrupted. One man, his voice cracking, shared that he hadn't spoken to anyone about his partner's death for 5 years. He said, "People told me to move on, but I never figured out where to move to." Keanu didn't flinch. He nodded softly, as if to say, "You're not alone in that." No phones were in sight. No one was recording. It wasn't for the world to see. It was for the people in that room, to speak without being fixed, heard without being evaluated. It felt like a sacred pause from everything else. As the minutes passed, the air in the suite held a quiet heaviness. A young man in his 20s, hands clenched tightly, finally spoke. "I haven't cried in 5 years, not even when my mom died. Tonight, I cried." His voice cracked. A woman beside him gently took his hand. No one judged. No one filled the silence. It was allowed to breathe. Keanu remained still, a quiet anchor. At one point, a woman reached over and rested her head briefly on his shoulder. He didn't move or react, just allowed the gesture to exist. It wasn't performative. It wasn't charity. It was human. A notebook passed around the circle. Each person wrote something. A name, a memory, a date. No one read it aloud. When it reached Keanu, he held it in his lap for a long moment. Then he added just one word. Still. Officer Alvarez wiped a tear from her cheek. She hadn't realized she was crying. "This is sacred," she whispered to Rachel. "This shouldn't be interrupted." Rachel nodded slowly. "It's not a disturbance. It's a healing." The officers stepped away from the door. Inside, the circle continued. Unbroken, unspoken, unforgettable. Later that night, as the hallway settled into a heavy stillness and the hum of the city dimmed into background noise, Officers Lee and Alvarez remained just beyond the open door of the penthouse suite. Neither said a word at first. The radio on Officer Lee's chest crackled softly with the dispatcher's inquiry, but he waited a moment before responding. "No signs of threat," he finally said into the mic. "No disturbance. The guest is safe." Guests, plural actually. It's a gathering. Calm, private, respectful. He hesitated, then added something he wasn't trained to say. "It's grief. That's what this is. Shared grief." Rachel Torres stood several feet away in the corridor, her arms crossed but her shoulders softening. As head of hotel security, she'd handled everything from brawls to celebrities breaking down under pressure. But this was different. There was no mess, no shouting, no drugs, no handlers rushing in to patch things over. This wasn't about scandal, control. It was about people being human in a world that usually didn't give them space to be. She looked into the suite again. The guests inside weren't moving much. Some leaned on each other. Some sat still with their eyes closed. But their breathing had settled. The chaos reported earlier had quieted into something reverent. And in the center of the room, still seated on the floor with the others, was Keanu Reeves. He hadn't changed positions. His posture remained low and unassuming, his eyes alert but not dominating. He was not leading the group. He was part of it, a fellow witness to pain, not a celebrity, not a public figure, just someone showing up when it mattered. A middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair stood slowly. She moved carefully across the rug, her steps deliberate. From the pocket of her cardigan, she pulled out a small photograph, folded many times over. Her hand trembled as she opened it. The lines across her face deepened as emotion surged. She approached Keanu and crouched in front of him. Everyone in the room watched, but no one interrupted. "My son," she whispered. "He was 9. He thought you were invincible. Said you made him feel like he could survive school, survive being small, survive anything." Keanu looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. He accepted the photograph gently, as if it were glass. On the picture was a grinning boy with wide cheeks and a makeshift superhero cape fashioned from a red kitchen towel. The photo's edges were curled. The ink had faded from sunlight or time, but the joy in the boy's face remained. Keanu didn't speak. He studied the boy's expression, his hand not trembling but still. After a moment, he placed the photo carefully in the center of the circle. Someone else had already placed a worn leather notebook there. Another had left a bracelet. These weren't offerings, they were markers, silent monuments to the weight each person had brought into this room. Then came stillness. No one cried for a while. No one filled the silence with stories or apologies. The moment didn't need language. It needed air and patience and the dignity of letting grief just be. Keanu reached over and gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. Not to comfort her, but to join her. His fingers curled loosely, his touch present but light, grounding her in the moment. And around them, no cameras clicked, no phones glowed. Only breath, only silence. And somehow, it was enough. Officer Jordan Lee stepped gently into the suite. His boots made almost no sound on the plush carpet. Denise Alvarez stayed back by the door, allowing her partner to approach without crowding the group. The lighting was dim but warm, and the room smelled faintly of lavender and wood. A sense of reverence lingered in the air. Keanu noticed the officer's presence and slowly rose from his seat. He didn't rush, he didn't gesture, he simply stood with quiet respect, his eyes soft and his hands at his sides. There was no panic, no embarrassment, just calm understanding. Officer Lee gave him a small nod. His voice was low and even. "Mr. Reeves, is everything all right here tonight?" Keanu looked around at the group still seated behind him. Some had their heads bowed. One man was holding another's hand. Another was wiping his eyes. There was no danger here, only wounds that had found a place to breathe. Keanu nodded gently. "Yes. I'm sorry if we disturbed anyone," he said. This wasn't meant to be loud. Sometimes emotions rise when we let them out. Officer Lee kept his gaze steady. "Can you tell me what's going on here, just so we can report back honestly?" Keanu took a slow breath. "This is a gathering I started a few years ago," he said. "Everyone here has either saved me or needed saving themselves." He looked over at a gray-haired man leaning on a cane near the window. "Some of them are stuntmen I worked with on films. One of them pulled me out of a burning stunt rig when something went wrong. Another was in a motorcycle crash and spent a year learning to walk again. Over there, that's Claire. She was my script supervisor on 3 different movies. She lost her daughter during filming, and no one knew because she kept showing up to work." His eyes landed on a woman with deep lines around her eyes, her fingers interlocked in her lap. Her gaze didn't shift. Keanu continued, "Ben, that's Arturo. He used to be a lighting grip. He was laid off after he had a stroke. He told me once he didn't feel like a man anymore. I told him he was more human than most of the people running the studios." Keanu paused, glancing back at Officer Lee. "They're not just co-workers. They're people who've carried invisible things for too long. This is a space where they can finally put some of it down." Lee blinked, visibly affected but professional. "I see," he said softly. Keanu added, "I use an alias when I check into hotels like this. I wanted it to be quiet, safe, but I understand why it sounded alarming. When people finally cry, it doesn't come out small." Behind him, someone chuckled gently through their tears. A man said, "He's right. We're not very good at grieving quietly." Lee glanced back at Alvarez. She nodded. There was no crime here. There was healing. And now, it had a name. Officer Alvarez took a quiet step forward, her eyes scanning the group. It wasn't chaos. It was raw and calm all at once. A man clutched a photo. Another drew quietly. A woman sat with her eyes closed, as if just breathing hurt. She spoke gently. "Mr. Reeves, are these guests all staying here?" Keanu nodded. "Some are, others just came tonight. I cover the rooms. Some of them don't have anywhere else to go." There was no grand explanation, just facts, no apology. Alvarez nodded slowly. "The reason we were called is the volume, the emotion. Guests thought someone might be in danger." Keanu looked down for a beat, then back up. In a way, they're not wrong. It is danger, not from each other, from what they carry inside. That's why they're here. The woman beside him lifted her head. Her voice was fragile. This is the only place I've ever said my daughter's name since she passed. I've been screaming it in silence for years. Tonight, I said it out loud. No one spoke. The moment asked for stillness, not noise. Officer Lee looked at Brandon, who stood quietly near the door. "You okay staying nearby just in case?" he asked. Brandon nodded, visibly moved. "Yes, I get it now." Keanu gave him a grateful look. "Thanks for not rushing in." A man from the group added, "This isn't therapy, it's just a room without pretending." Another whispered, "Some of us never had a place like that until now." Alvarez stepped back, lowering her radio. "We'll file a quiet report. I'd just ask that by midnight the floor is quiet for others." Keanu nodded. "That's completely fair." The officers turned to leave, but no one moved. It wasn't over, not for them. And for the first time in a long time, nobody felt alone. After the officers left, the door gently clicked shut, sealing the silence like a pact. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then the woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had mentioned her daughter, reached for a fresh tissue and let out a quiet breath. Keanu sat back down without a word. He wasn't a host here. He wasn't a star. He was one of them. A man shaped by loss, not defined by fame. Someone who'd been broken enough to recognize the pieces in others. A stuntman from an old film wiped his eyes. "Remember when I cracked 3 ribs jumping off that scaffolding in Vancouver? You sat with me at the hospital for 6 hours." Keanu smiled softly. "You saved my spine. Least I could do." Another woman, a former costume designer, chuckled through tears. "You found me in a parking lot one night when I was ready to give up. You didn't say much, just handed me tea and sat there. That silence changed everything." People nodded. They weren't here to retell old favors. They were stitching together what those moments meant now, how they'd stayed with them, how they'd mattered long after the headlines moved on. Someone asked, "Keanu, what about you? Who do you talk to?" He didn't hesitate. "Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just listen, like tonight." A beat passed. Then he added, "But when I do talk, it's usually to Jennifer. In the cemetery. Or to my daughter. I imagined what she'd be like at 15. What kind of music she'd hate me playing in the car. It wasn't said for sympathy. It was said because it was true, and in this room, truth was sacred." A man in the corner, older, balding, with watery eyes, leaned forward. "My son died 3 years ago. No one at work ever brought it up. They acted like he never existed. But here, tonight, I felt like he did." Keanu looked at him. "He does." The group sat in reverent stillness. There were no experts, no solutions, just shared survival. One person suggested they close with a name circle, just saying the name of the person they carried and one word to describe the weight. Everyone agreed. The names began: Maya, Hope, Elijah, Rage, June, Silence, Thomas, Regret. Keanu's voice was the last. Ava, Light. Then nothing. Not even the city noise could break it. This wasn't a celebrity scandal. It wasn't a tabloid moment. It was something bigger. This was a room where people finally felt seen, where grief wasn't awkward, where pain wasn't hurried along, where healing came not from answers, but from being allowed to feel the question fully. And when the lights dimmed low, when the group began to quietly part ways for the night, they each carried something home. Less shame. More humanity. No cameras had caught this, but the echo would linger long after. The room had gone quiet again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that made people feel safe enough to speak. Then a young man near the edge of the circle cleared his throat. His hands were clasped tight together, knuckles white. His name tag said Leo. He took a breath, shaky but determined. "I don't talk much," he began, eyes down. "Not in groups like this, but I think I owe it to say something." The group listened without interrupting. Leo looked up slowly, eyes scanning faces that had already shared parts of their soul. 2 years ago, I crashed my motorcycle on Mulholland Drive. I woke up with both legs broken and my right hand mangled. They told me I'd never ride again, that I might never even walk without a limp. He paused, swallowing. I was 24. Riding was my life, my future. Everything I'd built was tied to that machine. And in one moment, it was gone. There was no dramatic music, no pity, just nods of understanding. People who'd lost different things but knew the same kind of pain. I went home to my apartment and wrote a note, Leo said, voice cracking. I had pills lined up. I didn't want to wake up again. He glanced at Keanu, then smiled, faintly. But I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, from him. Keanu looked up gently, saying nothing. It just said, I heard what happened. I've lost things too. Doesn't mean you're done. If you want to talk, I'll listen. If not, I'll still be here. Leo blinked back tears. I don't know how he found out. I didn't care. I needed someone to say I wasn't worthless. The group sat still, gripped by the honesty. Leo exhaled. I didn't take the pills. I emailed him back. He responded every single time. And now I'm here. Alive. Talking. Because someone believed I was still worth saving. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything Leo couldn't say. And everyone in that room understood it perfectly. After Leo finished, a middle-aged woman with streaks of silver in her hair quietly placed a hand over her heart. Her name tag read Rena. She had sat quietly through most of the evening, head down, listening, but now she spoke. I was in wardrobe, she said softly, on one of Keanu's early films. Nothing glamorous. I did stitching, backups, coffee runs. No one knew my name. She took a long breath. Until the day my daughter died. The room froze. 15 years old, drunk driver. I didn't come back to work. I couldn't even get out of bed. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. 3 days after the funeral, a bouquet of white lilies showed up at my door. No card, just a folded note. She smiled slightly at the memory. It said, You're not invisible. Your pain matters. If you need to scream, I'll sit in the silence after. I thought it was from a friend, but the handwriting looked familiar. She looked at Keanu. Then came the calls. Not frequent, not demanding, just check-ins. He never brought up acting, never pushed me, just listened. And eventually I started talking again. There were tears in her voice now. This circle, it's not about fame. It's about being seen when you feel erased. Keanu's eyes remained lowered, his hands clasped softly in his lap. He hadn't spoken once, but the impact of his presence was loud enough. One by one, others began to share. A former stuntman who broke his back during a filming accident and spiraled into depression. A production assistant who'd lost her brother to suicide. A young woman who had been homeless until she met Keanu volunteering at a food shelter under an alias. None of them had sought publicity. None had shared their stories publicly. But every voice that spoke carried the weight of someone who had almost given up, until someone reminded them they mattered. By the time it circled back to Officer Lee, even she was quietly emotional. Has this group been meeting long? She asked gently. One of the men nodded. Every few months, sometimes less, depends who needs it. And always here? She asked. No, Leo replied. Different places, but always led the same way. By Keanu? Leo shook his head. By silence, he just opens the door. We do the rest. Denise Alvarez stood near the back of the room, her hands still at her sides. The scene unfolding wasn't one she could classify by protocol. No threats. No crimes. Just pain shared in whispers. A man named Harris leaned forward. "I was a body double for Keanu in the late 90s, he began. "Dislocated my shoulder doing a motorcycle stunt. Production forgot. But he didn't." He paused, eyes searching the floor. "Months later, I got a letter. A check, too. But it was the letter that mattered. It said, 'Thank you. I remember. That's the only reason I'm still here.'" The room was silent, but not heavy. The kind of silence that holds space for stories long buried. Then came Denise, the second one in the room. She had worked as a camera assistant on a shelved project. After the film tanked, she lost her home. One day, she saw Keanu in a grocery store. "My card declined," she said softly. "I turned to leave. He just said, 'It's okay. I've got it.' No speech, no advice, just kindness." Keanu looked up for the first time in minutes. He didn't speak, but his presence was steady, quiet. Officer Lee shifted. "There's nothing wrong here, but if you'd ever like us to coordinate, just let us know." We didn't understand what we were walking into. Keanu nodded. "Thank you, and I'm sorry the guests were disturbed." Rachel Torres, near the door, added gently, "Most of us didn't recognize the sound. We're used to chaos or celebration. This was different. I think that's why people called. They heard healing and mistook it for trouble." That struck a nerve. Healing doesn't always sound calm. Sometimes it's tears in the dark. Sometimes it's 12 people in a circle, exhaling at last. Officer Alvarez finally said, "In 12 years, I've walked into a lot of pain. Tonight's the first time it felt like peace." No one applauded. No one stood. But something inside the circle shifted. The two officers left quietly, and inside that suite, the conversation resumed. No more confusion. No more fear. Only honesty. After the officers stepped out, a soft voice rose within the circle. A woman in her late 60s, silver curls tucked behind her ears, adjusted the scarf around her neck and gently placed a hand on her knee. She cleared her throat once, not to command the room, but to ground herself. Then she spoke. "My name is Dr. Nina Evans," she said with quiet authority. "I'm a retired trauma therapist, licensed for over 30 years. I've worked with veterans, first responders, and survivors of abuse. And I'm here tonight not as a professional, but as part of this circle." Her eyes scanned the room, making contact with each person, not to assess, but to affirm. "We are not just a gathering of people trying to survive. This group, what you're witnessing here, is built on structure. We follow a mutual aid model, grounded in safety protocols and wellness planning. Every participant signs a consent agreement. We track episodes of acute distress, and we ensure no one leaves without a wellness check." She paused to let that land. "This evening," Nina continued, "we had 3 members facing suicidal ideation. We didn't want to separate them. The hospital was not an option. They'd been through that route before, and it made things worse. So, Keanu offered us this space, his suite." All heads turned toward Keanu, who stayed silent. He simply dipped his head in acknowledgement. Nina's voice grew steadier. "We are not here because of celebrity. We're here because of continuity. Most of us have been meeting for years, in private, at rotating locations. Always low profile, always intentional." Her words weren't defensive. They were measured, calm, and deeply informed by years of experience. She didn't try to prove legitimacy, she embodied it. She continued, "I know this might be hard to understand. People assume healing is sterile, bright rooms, clean charts. But healing, real healing, is often messy. It cries, it shakes, it whispers instead of shouts." A few in the circle nodded, their posture softening. "What you heard tonight," she said, "wasn't chaos. It was safety finally finding a voice." The room stilled again, not from awkwardness, but from the recognition of something sacred. Officer Alvarez lowered her notebook slightly. She didn't write down a word of what Dr. Nina said, but her expression made it clear she was absorbing every syllable. Dr. Nina turned to both officers now. We understand the concern, truly. The volume, the emotion. It can sound alarming from the outside, but inside this space, those very things are part of the healing. We've trained ourselves to hold space for one another in exactly these moments. Then she added something that caught everyone's attention. There was no screaming tonight, no threats, just release. You're hearing people who in most settings never feel safe enough to speak their truth, but in here, they finally do. She gestured to a younger woman sitting beside her, whose hands trembled slightly in her lap. The woman gave a faint nod. That's Stephanie, Nina said gently. She hasn't spoken in over a week. Tonight she did. One full sentence. And afterward, she cried. The room didn't clap. They didn't need to. Instead, one of the men beside her passed her a tissue and rested his hand softly on her back. Alvarez took a deep breath and looked at Officer Lee. Dr. Nina, Lee asked, are there any medications involved? Anything we should know about? No controlled substances, Nina replied. Some participants have prescriptions for their own conditions, but nothing is distributed here. This is strictly emotional peer support. We don't do interventions. We don't advise. We witness. Officer Lee nodded. He glanced around at the people sitting quietly. None looked unstable or intoxicated. Most looked drained, but not unsafe. Nina continued. The only reason we gathered here, rather than our usual location, was because 3 of our members had recently experienced a triggering event. One lost a son, another was assaulted, the third had a relapse. We knew the usual space, a cold community hall, wouldn't hold them the way they needed. Her voice softened, like a mother explaining something tender to a worried friend. Keanu didn't hesitate. He said, Come, be here. Let them breathe. That's why we're here. Keanu still hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. His presence did the speaking. And as the officers stood in the quiet presence of this group, something shifted inside both of them. Officer Alvarez stepped back, scanning the circle again. Many of the faces showed visible marks of hardship, scars, limps, tired eyes. But none looked broken. They looked like survivors leaning on each other. Dr. Nina returned to her spot, not as a leader, but as an equal. There was no hierarchy here, just quiet strength, passed silently from person to person. Officer Lee finally spoke, keeping his tone soft. Thank you all for your patience. We were called here for a welfare check, and what we found was something good. I want you to know we're here to help, not interfere. If this group ever needs anything from us, we're available. Keanu nodded in appreciation. Most others gave quiet glances of thanks. Rachel Torres, the hotel's head of security, stepped in. She had waited outside, unsure what to expect. But as she saw the circle, the tissues, the stillness, her posture shifted. I'll file this carefully and ensure discretion, she said gently. But I do need someone to confirm that there's no medical emergency. Dr. Nina raised her hand. I'll submit that in writing. Rachel nodded. Then she looked at Keanu and whispered, Next time you start a movement, give us a heads up. Keanu smiled. No movement, just space to breathe. As the officers left, Keanu walked them to the door. Alvarez paused and asked, You saved them tonight, didn't you? He looked back at the group. They saved me first. I just opened the door. Then he closed it gently behind them. In the lobby, Brandon Hale stood at the desk, tense. When the officers exited the elevator, calm and nodding, he exhaled in relief. Is everything okay? He asked. Officer Lee nodded. Better than okay. What's happening upstairs is healing, not trouble. Brandon looked at the complaint log. He closed the book. Upstairs, the mood was still. Someone refilled the kettle. A man with burn scars passed a small carved stone around the circle. No one spoke. Each person held it for a moment before handing it on. Keanu sat quietly, leaning back. He wasn't checking on the group anymore. He was part of it. Dr. Nina folded her hands in her lap. She had guided many sessions before, but this was different. This circle needed no leader, because in this room, silence had already done the talking. After the officers left and the room settled into a quiet calm, Dr. Nina stood and made her way to the corner of the suite where a weathered leather satchel sat beside her chair. She opened it and pulled out a thick folder. Handwritten notes, color-coded tabs, and carefully printed documents. She returned to the circle and handed it to Keanu, who passed it along to Officer Alvarez. "These are the guidelines we use," Nina explained softly. "We're not just a group of friends trying to talk our way through pain. This is a system we've built, one that's structured, intentional, and deeply personal." Alvarez opened the folder and saw the first page, Peer Support Trauma Framework, adapted for entertainment and public service professionals. Each member of the group, Nina explained, had a designated partner in what they called the buddy system. No one ever left a session alone. If someone showed signs of crisis, they would stay with their buddy until a wellness checkpoint had been completed. It wasn't about rules, it was about presence. "We have scheduled check-ins every 24 hours for anyone who flags themselves," she added. "Each person knows when to reach out and when to intervene." Officer Lee leaned in slightly, impressed. "This is more organized than some departments I've seen." Nina smiled. It had to be. These aren't just hurting people. These are people the world watches and forgets are still human. Keanu nodded, glancing around the room. "I've been in that space. People asking for autographs while you're grieving, crowds outside your hotel while you're trying to sleep off panic attacks. The pressure to perform never ends. This group gives people a break from that noise." The documents outlined everything: emergency contacts, quiet room guidelines, grounding exercises, even designated emotional response types. They used symbols for red-level crises, yellow-level concerns, and green-level clearance for members who felt stable. Each week, someone rotated as the wellness keeper. That person's job was to maintain safety plans, update emergency info, and track any changes to behavior or risk factors. None of it was imposed. It was earned through trust, vulnerability, and months of showing up. And it all started, Dr. Nina explained, with one night nearly 2 years ago when Keanu sat with a grieving father in a hospital hallway. End of hall. That's when the system was born. Dr. Nina continued, her voice steady but warm. "We realized that night that no amount of therapy or fame could replace what people truly need when they're at their lowest. A hand on their shoulder, someone who remembers their name, someone who doesn't flinch when things get ugly." Officer Alvarez flipped through more pages in the binder. There were handwritten entries by group members, notes of encouragement, personal reflections, action plans. One page had a heart drawn in the corner beside a checklist titled, "When I Feel Like Disappearing." It included things like, text my buddy, touch something cold, read my favorite page from Nina's book, and remember Leo's voice. Leo, who had spoken earlier, gave a soft chuckle. "Yeah, I talk too much. But sometimes that's the point. My voice became someone else's rope, so I keep talking." The officers were silent for a moment, absorbing what they had walked into. They'd been prepared for danger. What they found was something far more rare. An intentional sanctuary designed with love and shaped by pain. Rachel Torres, who had been watching from near the door, stepped forward. She wasn't used to seeing this side of people. In her world, crying often meant weakness, chaos, or risk. But here, it was different. It was sacred. "This is impressive," she said honestly. "But what happens if someone doesn't check in? What if a buddy system fails?" Nina looked at her with the calm intensity only a seasoned therapist could carry. That's why we have layers. If someone misses a check-in, 2 people are alerted. If they miss 2, it goes to the wellness keeper, and we activate the response plan. She turned to Keanu. That's what happened tonight. Keanu spoke gently. 3 people messaged the group within 20 minutes. Each one used a different phrase, but they all said the same thing. We're not okay. So the group gathered, quietly, immediately, without questions. They didn't wait until morning. They didn't delegate it to someone else. They came. Because that's what they do. They've seen what happens when people delay care, when shame keeps someone silent, when mental health becomes a footnote. Not here. Not in this room. Here, action replaces hesitation, and love replaces fear. Officer Lee, who had remained mostly quiet, finally spoke. I've responded to dozens of wellness checks. Most of them end with confusion, someone scared, sometimes worse. But I've never seen anything like this. Keanu nodded slowly, but his gaze was fixed on a young woman across the room. She had tear-streaked cheeks and trembling fingers, but she was breathing evenly now. Her name was Maria, and she was one of the 3 in crisis that evening. She's here because the system worked, Keanu said. No one had to call a hotline. No one had to sit alone in a bathtub wondering if they mattered. We beat the clock tonight. Officer Alvarez looked at Maria. Do you feel safe here? Maria looked up. I've been in hospitals. I've been in group homes. I've seen the inside of a padded room. Nothing compares to this. I feel human here. Not sick, not broken, just human, Nina added. That's why this isn't just a group. It's a movement. We're trying to show people that mental health care doesn't have to be cold or clinical or last resort. It can be warm, early, and ongoing. Prevention, not just response. She handed Officer Lee a laminated sheet. It was a flowchart, color-coded and clearly designed. It showed exactly how the group escalated situations, how members rotated buddy duties, and how even facilitators had support of their own. Every system here has a backup, Nina said. Even I'm not exempt. Rachel glanced around again, finally understanding the scale. And you do all this in silence? Keanu smiled faintly. Sometimes silence isn't absence. It's the space where healing happens. The officers looked at each other and nodded. There was nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, nothing requiring intervention. Only a group of people, anchored by pain, held together by grace. Officer Alvarez tucked the documents back into the folder. You have our number if anything changes. Keanu thanked them sincerely. Then, before they left, Maria stood up. Wait, she said, her voice shaky but firm. Thank you for checking. Thank you for caring enough to knock. The officers paused, then both nodded and quietly stepped out. Behind them, the door clicked shut. And the circle remained, breathing together, healing together. The suite had grown quiet again after the officers left. Most of the group members remained seated, still grounded in their collective breath. But Officer Lee lingered in the hallway just outside the door, talking quietly with Rachel and Officer Alvarez. Rachel gave a small nod toward Keanu. You know, they weren't kidding when they said he's the reason this whole thing holds together. Officer Lee glanced through the doorway. We know him as an actor, a good one, a quiet one, but this... He trailed off. A few minutes later, as the group began wrapping up and Nina dismissed the circle, Officer Lee gently asked Keanu if they could speak privately. Keanu didn't hesitate. He stepped aside with the officers and Rachel, into a smaller side room near the kitchen. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, gaze distant but composed. Can I ask you something? Officer Lee began. Why you? Why are you the one hosting this? There was a pause. Keanu looked down at the floor, as if tracing invisible words across the hardwood. Because I've been the person on the edge. He said it simply, no flourish, no dramatics, just a quiet truth placed into the space. Officer Alvarez stayed silent, sensing something deeper coming. Keanu continued. My daughter died at birth. My partner Jennifer passed not long after in an accident. I lost my best friend River to something that should have never happened. He swallowed, the memory catching in his throat. I've seen too many people disappear. Quietly. Privately. Beautiful people with nowhere to go when the pain got too loud. I survived, but surviving isn't the same as healing. I learned that the hard way. Rachel, who had only ever known Keanu through hotel records and tabloid mentions, stood still, stunned. I host these meetings, Keanu said, because if I don't, maybe someone like Leo or Maria doesn't get another night. There was a fragile silence. Then he added, almost in a whisper, and because I can't watch it happen again, not in silence, not anymore. Officer Lee took a slow breath, visibly moved. In his years on the force, he had dealt with countless situations involving mental health, despair, and tragedy. But this was different. This wasn't an intervention. This was a sanctuary, built not out of charity, but out of shared pain. Officer Alvarez finally spoke. Do the others know your story, about your losses? Keanu gave a small nod. Some of them, not all. I don't open with it. This group isn't about me. It's about trust. I'm just present. He paused, then added, I don't have formal training like Dr. Evans. I don't run the sessions. I don't lead discussions. But I sit in every one. I listen. I remember their stories. And when they don't show up, I call. Rachel looked at him. Every single person here tonight? You keep in touch with all of them? Keanu nodded. Every week. Some every day. It's not that hard once you decide their lives matter. The words hung in the air. Simple. Final. Alvarez looked back at the main room where the group was slowly dispersing. Some hugged. Others quietly packed up their things. There was no chaos, no instability, just people who had found a place to breathe without judgment. Officer Lee stepped forward again. You do this often? Twice a month, Keanu replied. Sometimes more when someone's struggling. I offer a space. I provide food. Nina handles the rest. She screens people carefully. We have emergency contacts. It's not perfect, but it's safe. Rachel was still quiet. In all her years managing security at high-end properties, she had dealt with noise complaints, celebrities throwing tantrums, and guests hiding all sorts of misbehavior. But she had never seen anything like this. A support system hidden in plain sight. You really think this makes a difference? She asked. Keanu turned to her, and for the first time, his eyes met hers fully. I don't think, he said. I know. Rachel folded her arms, not out of defiance but to steady herself. She had entered the evening expecting to deal with a celebrity crisis. Perhaps substance abuse, perhaps a breakdown. But instead she had walked into a quiet revolution, one led not by ego or noise, but by presence. Keanu walked over to a side table where a small stack of journals rested. He picked one up and handed it to Rachel. The cover was soft and worn, the pages inside filled with careful notes, wellness plans, and hand-signed entries. Each person who attended the group had a section. It was a system. It was intentional. We call these the anchors, he said gently. They're not therapy records, just reflections, goals, promises to themselves. If someone goes quiet, we read through these. They help us find our way back to them. Rachel flipped through a few pages. On one, in bold ink, someone had written, Today, I stayed. That's enough. Her throat tightened. Alvarez approached Keanu once more, softer now. You're not obligated to do this. You could just live your life. Why take on this weight? Keanu didn't hesitate. Because too many people have carried mine. He let the words settle. Not dramatic, just real. And if I've been given peace, he continued, Then maybe the least I can do is offer shelter. At that moment, one of the younger group members walked past, eyes still red but posture lighter. He stopped beside Keanu and gave him a small nod of gratitude. Keanu returned it with a quiet hand on the shoulder. There was no performance in it, no spotlight, just understanding. Rachel slowly exhaled, then looked at the officers and nodded. "We won't be filing a report," she said quietly, "but thank you for letting us understand." Keanu offered a soft, almost tired smile. "Thanks for listening." And with that, the room returned to calm, like a ripple fading gently into still water. What had started as a hotel disturbance had become something else entirely. A glimpse into the quiet power of someone choosing to stand in the dark with others instead of fleeing from it. After the officers stepped quietly into the hallway, Rachel lingered behind, curiosity stirring something deeper than duty. She turned back and asked one last question. How many people has this group actually helped? Dr. Nina Evans glanced toward Keanu, who gave her a small nod of approval. "In the last year alone," she said softly, "we've supported over 30 individuals. Some were on the verge of taking their lives. Others were battling terminal illness without support. A few came straight off the streets." Rachel's eyes widened. "And all this," she asked, "from inside this room?" Nina smiled gently. "From this room, from phone calls, from late-night drives to clinics, from whispered check-ins and anonymous care packages. This group doesn't just meet here. We reach people wherever they fall." Keanu stepped forward, almost hesitant. "We don't talk about it publicly. We're not an organization. We're just people who remember what it felt like to be forgotten." He pulled out a folder from his bag and handed it to Rachel. Inside were photocopies, blurred names, redacted faces, but the stories remain. A stuntman paralyzed after a crash, who now teaches safety courses at film schools. A teenage runaway found sleeping behind a bus terminal, now working at a coffee shop and studying art therapy online. A cancer patient, estranged from family, who was flown home for hospice thanks to anonymous airfare and hotel arrangements. Rachel flipped through the pages, each story more staggering than the last. "Who funds this?" she whispered, already suspecting the answer. Keanu looked away briefly. "Sometimes I do. Sometimes others chip in when they can, but money's not the point. Dignity is." Rachel swallowed hard. She had walked into this evening expecting to enforce protocol. Instead, she had stumbled into a quiet operation of grace. "Why stay anonymous?" she asked. Keanu gave a small, tired smile. "Because when someone's at their lowest, the last thing they need is a camera in their face. They just need someone to stand with them until the shaking stops." Officer Lee returned from the hallway, his expression softer than before. He had seen countless situations, domestic disputes, overdoses, false alarms. But this was different. He motioned to Rachel. "I think we need to change how we categorize this call," he said. "It's not a disturbance, it's something else entirely." Rachel nodded in agreement. "It's quiet intervention." Nina gathered the empty tea mugs from around the room while a few group members folded up blankets and pillows. Their movements were gentle, practiced, like they'd done this 100 times before. Officer Alvarez walked over to a young woman sitting by the window. Her eyes were puffy from crying, but there was peace behind the tears. "You okay?" Alvarez asked gently. The young woman nodded. "I lost my brother last month. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I came here because someone said this group wouldn't ask questions, just sit with me." And they did. Alvarez looked around again, the full weight of the night sinking in. These weren't strangers gathered for drama. They were wounded people finding quiet restoration. Keanu knelt beside a man clutching a worn photo of his daughter. The man had barely spoken all night, but now he whispered, "Thank you, brother." Keanu didn't respond with words. He just squeezed the man's shoulder and stayed there. Rachel pulled her phone out and slowly deleted the initial incident report she had started earlier. "No one needs to see this on a log," she murmured. Lee glanced at her. "You sure?" Rachel looked back at the circle. If the world knew what was really happening here, this safe space might vanish. Let's not be the reason it disappears. As they made their way out, Nina handed each officer a small envelope. "For your time," she said, "and your understanding." Inside were handwritten notes from members of the group. Simple words of thanks, scribbled in various styles. No names, no dates. Just messages of quiet gratitude from people who were still here because someone had listened. As the officers stepped into the hallway, they paused one last time and looked back at the suite. The door was now partially closed. From inside, the faint sound of soft laughter drifted out, followed by a lull of silence that felt more comforting than empty. Officer Alvarez took a breath. "Do you think anyone will ever know?" she asked. Lee shook his head slowly. "That's the point. They're not doing it to be known." At the front desk, Brandon was still on duty. Rachel briefed him quietly. No names, no gossip, just enough for him to close the ticket in the system as a resolved welfare check with no further action. Brandon didn't ask questions. He just nodded, grateful it hadn't turned into something worse. Later that night, as Rachel walked to her car, she replayed the evening in her head. She'd handled thousands of hotel calls in her career. Noise complaints, celebrity tantrums, even the occasional tabloid ambush. But tonight something shifted. She realized that sometimes the loudest moments don't come from chaos, but from people choosing stillness and support. 2 weeks later, Rachel received a letter at her home. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a single line handwritten across the center. "Thank you for not shutting the door on healing." She kept it in her wallet. The Bellevue Grand never updated its policies. Nothing official ever changed. But the staff talked, quietly, respectfully. If a certain penthouse suite was booked under the name Charles Andrews, they knew to give it space. They didn't pry. They didn't photograph. They just let it be. And across the city, stories began to spread quietly. Stories of people who had vanished from the brink. A painter back in rehab. A single mother reunited with her son. A veteran finally sleeping through the night. All connected by whispers. All tracing back to one quiet circle on a Tuesday night in Los Angeles. No headlines, no cameras, just lives slowly reclaiming light. Because someone like Keanu Reeves refused to let them be forgotten. Officer Denise Alvarez stood silently near the doorway, her eyes fixed on the people still sitting together on the floor. The emotional weight of what she had just witnessed pressed heavily on her chest. These weren't strangers anymore. Each face carried a story. One she hadn't heard in full, but could feel in the air. The rawness, the survival, the love. She turned toward Officer Jordan Lee, her voice hushed but trembling. "Jordan, I thought we were walking into a crisis, but this is something else." He gave her a small nod, then stepped gently into the center of the room. Keanu Reeves looked up from his seat, meeting his eyes with calm stillness. The group instinctively quieted, sensing something important was about to be said. Officer Lee placed one hand slowly over his chest. "With all due respect," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've saved more lives than most of us ever will." A few people gasped softly. Others simply bowed their heads in recognition. Alvarez wiped a tear from her cheek and added, "You're not just helping. You're doing something we rarely get to see in our line of work. Preventing pain before it turns into tragedy." Keanu didn't speak. He didn't have to. The gratitude in his eyes said enough. Lee looked around the room again. "We're not here to shut this down," he continued. "There won't be any reports filed, no alerts, no leaks, not from us." The group exhaled together in quiet relief. "But," he added, We want to help you protect this. From the outside world, from anyone who might try to twist it into something it's not. Rachel Torres, still standing near the hallway, stepped forward. I can implement some internal safeguards, she said. Discreet ones. Guest logs, floor access, sound checks. Without alerting press or hotel execs. Keanu finally spoke, his voice soft. That means more than you know. Lee nodded. Then it's settled. We don't just walk away tonight. We walk with you. And with that, a new alliance quietly formed. Not by force, but through shared purpose and human compassion. After the emotional exchange, the atmosphere in the suite softened. A subtle sense of trust replaced the earlier tension. Officer Alvarez slowly made her way toward a young woman sitting near the window, her knees pulled to her chest, eyes still swollen from crying. She knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on the floor instead of reaching out. The silence between them was not awkward, it was respectful. Are you okay? Alvarez asked. The woman nodded slowly. I am now. I wasn't a few hours ago. Alvarez's eyes didn't leave hers. I'm really glad you found this place, the woman whispered. Keanu found me. That simple sentence hung in the air, heavier than anything else spoken that night. Meanwhile, Officer Lee moved closer to Dr. Nina Evans. This group you've built, he said, it's rare, structured, thoughtful. It's what people need. Dr. Evans responded with humility. We're not professionals anymore, not in the traditional sense, but we know trauma. We know what silence can do. Lee nodded. That's why we're going to support you. Unofficially, quietly, but fully. He paused before continuing. If there's ever an emergency, or if you think someone's being watched, followed, or threatened, contact us directly. No need to go through dispatch. Dr. Evans looked moved. You'd do that? Absolutely. We've seen too many people fall through the cracks because nobody was willing to make space for them. You've made space. Alvarez joined them again. We'll talk to the hotel GM. Frame this as an informal agreement. Wellness support for high-profile guests. Privacy maintained. It'll keep the higher-ups at ease. Keanu raised his eyebrows, surprised. You'd vouch for us? Lee looked at him with absolute clarity. In a heartbeat, he turned back to the group. You don't owe us explanations. You've already proven this works. All we ask is that you keep doing it. With the same heart, the same care. For the first time since their arrival, a few people smiled. A fragile peace had been restored, not because authority demanded it, but because understanding walked into the room and listened. Officer Alvarez stepped back to take in the room. The people here weren't names on case files or blurred faces on surveillance footage. They were survivors, each carrying a story that could have ended in silence, and somehow, against all odds, they found this circle, this refuge. She turned to Keanu once more. You didn't just offer them a room. You offered them a reason to stay alive. Keanu's response was almost a whisper. They gave me the same. No one responded right away. There was too much truth in his voice to fill with words. It was the kind of statement that didn't require applause or sympathy, only respect. Officer Lee finally broke the silence. Look, most people don't see what we see. They don't know what it's like to walk into homes and find what's left after hope has run out. Tonight, we walked into something rare, something alive. Simple. Rachel Torres, who had remained quietly near the entrance, finally spoke. You know, I almost called the news, not to leak anything, but because I thought something tragic was happening here. I had no idea it would be the opposite. Keanu looked at her. That's okay, you were doing your job. She shook her head. No. Tonight reminded me why I chose this job in the first place. To protect people before the crisis hits. I forgot that mattered. Dr. Evans approached Rachel, offering her a small binder. This is our framework. If the hotel ever wants a formal copy, here. Rachel took it slowly, flipping through the tabs. check-in procedures, de-escalation guidelines, mental health protocols, confidentiality rules. It was all there, structured, humane, and deeply intentional. Officer Lee looked to his partner. "We'll handle the report. Noise complaint, resolved without issue, nothing else." Alvarez smiled. "And if anyone ever asks, we never walked in." Huh. Keanu looked around at the people who had come seeking peace, who had almost been exposed to the world. He nodded with quiet gratitude. The officers nodded back. And then, just like that, they left. Not because they had to, but because they trusted what they'd found. The lobby had quieted, midnight had passed, and the echo of the city hummed faintly beyond the glass doors. Keanu stood near the exit with two group members beside him, Leo and a woman named Nia, her eyes still puffy but calm. The three of them moved slowly, not rushed, as if the weight of what had just happened deserved reverence. As they reached the entrance, the doorman gave Keanu a subtle nod, one that held no recognition of fame, just understanding. Outside, the air was cooler than expected. The lights from nearby lampposts cast long shadows across the pavement. A passing taxi slowed, mistaking them for potential riders, then moved on when Keanu shook his head gently. The footage went. Nia leaned against one of the columns, her hands trembling slightly. She looked up at Keanu, not with admiration, but with something deeper. "I wouldn't be here without this man," she whispered to Leo, who nodded in silent agreement. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. The strength of what had been shared upstairs didn't require commentary. He simply stood between them, anchoring their presence, offering stability by existing. A moment passed. Then Nia turned to him. "You didn't have to do any of this," he finally answered, voice soft. That's why it mattered. It wasn't said for effect. It wasn't part of some well-rehearsed line. It was simply the truth. He had nothing to gain, no one was watching, and yet he gave, because it was needed. The glass doors opened again. Dr. Nina Evans stepped out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and joined the three in silence. No one rushed away. No one said goodbye. They stood there for a few more minutes, as if the world had paused long enough to let them breathe. And when they finally parted ways, it was without ceremony, just quiet nods, shared glances, and the invisible bond of survival. Inside, the lights of the suite dimmed. Upstairs, the others rested, some in blankets, some seated on rugs, held not by luxury, but by something far more rare: trust. Rachel Torres stood just inside the lobby, watching the group from a distance. She hadn't said much since the officers had assured her no action would be taken. But something in her had shifted. The entire evening had begun with concern, maybe even fear, and yet it had ended with something she hadn't expected to witness in her decades of security work. Healing that had no script, no professional badge, no stage. She glanced at Officer Denise Alvarez as she walked by, still wiping her eyes. "You okay?" Rachel asked quietly. Denise nodded. "More than okay. Just reminded what people are capable of when they love without needing applause." Rachel smiled faintly, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She knew now they had done the right thing. Not because they followed protocol, but because they had listened. Upstairs, Leo lingered a moment longer in the hallway outside the suite. He stared at the number on the door before turning to go. This place wasn't just a hotel anymore. For some, it had become the space between despair and recovery. And the man behind that door had made that possible, not through speeches or grand gestures, but by showing up again and again for people the world had forgotten. What Keanu created wasn't a formal program. It wasn't advertised or structured for public praise. It was made of something simpler, something stronger. Presence, trust, and consistency. And maybe that was the most revolutionary part. That someone so famous, so public, could offer something so intimate without ever needing to say his name. As the elevator doors closed behind Leo, he exhaled for the first time in hours. His hand tightened slightly around a folded note Keanu had given him, just 2 lines scribbled on hotel stationery. "You are not broken, you are becoming." That line would stay with him through the lonely mornings, the bad days, and eventually the good ones too. What started as a noise complaint had turned into a glimpse behind the curtain, and what the world would never see was exactly what made it sacred. Outside the hotel, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Taxis gliding past, neon signs flickering, conversations drifting from corners. But on the quieter side of the street, under the gentle halo of a street lamp, Keanu stood with 2 group members. One of them, a woman in her late 40s named Alana, had tears still glistening in her eyes. The other, a younger man with tattoos peeking from his sleeves, held his backpack close. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. As they prepared to walk off into the night, Alana turned back. Her voice was soft, trembling with both gratitude and disbelief. "I wouldn't be here without this man." Keanu didn't respond. He simply offered a small nod and a gentle hand on her shoulder. Then he turned and walked back inside, his figure vanishing into the quiet hum of the lobby. Not every act of heroism makes headlines. Not every life saved shows up in statistics. Sometimes healing looks like 12 worn faces in a circle, tissues scattered, pain spoken aloud. Sometimes the most powerful interventions happen in whispers, in presence, in simply staying when it would be easier to walk away. Have you ever been saved by someone quietly supporting you? Comment below with the person who changed your life. You never know who needs to hear it. And tell us, what story would you like to see next from Keanu's life? Because sometimes the most incredible stories aren't found in the spotlight. They unfold in the shadows, in silence, and in circles held by someone who chooses to care.